we're spending more on science and engineering right now this year with the infrastructure bill and now the Inflation Reduction Act. And then, if you take the $90 billion that the DoD spends on science and engineering, we're actually spending more on science and engineering than defense for the first time, I think, ever as a country. And it blows my mind that we're not actually talking about that. And it's really cool. I think that we're actually making a lot of progress on basically moving us from this kind of like lab-based pilot scale kind of thing to kind of scaling up to the national level where we can actually make a huge impact on the bigger problem of climate change.
So, I'll start, and I think it makes most sense to probably start with how bad is climate change.
Yeah,
but to get to
I agree.
the end of it real quick, because you mentioned it, just to give, I'll fully admit, I think that you've probably read at least the environmental portions of the Inflation Reduction Act far more than I have. I've skimmed it, but it's not something, I'm not going to claim that I read through it all. How much would you estimate the spending for environmental projects is in the Inflation Reduction Act?
Oh, in my video, I have it. I think it's like $350 billion.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not going to hold you to an exact number.
Yeah.
I don't even have a ballpark idea.
It's big. It's big. And then the infrastructure bill, I think, had like 200 on it. And then the DoD spends more than all the other agencies combined, the NSF, NIH, DOE, NOAA, all that kind of stuff combined. DoD spends more on that. And since it's kind of like the number one DoD threat to national security is actually climate change, they say, because it's basically how we get our energy, how our economy is fueled. So if we have to rely on foreign countries in order to import that as like the blood kind of our economy, it's a really bad thing. So the Navy is spending heavily into things like algae biofuels because it can run their planes, that kind of thing. So
it's clear, just to start out, it's not just something that you think's an important issue. These are people at the top levels of the government.
Oh, yeah.
They're at least $500 billion just here recently, probably been well over $1 trillion in the past decade that we've been spending on this sort of stuff. And I think you're correct that a lot of people in positions of power, even some that would be unexpected, say that, like, for example, military people say that climate change is a big issue for some of those reasons you said. So just to kind of put the framework for this discussion out there, this is an issue that many people think, including those in positions of power, is sort of the premier issue that we're facing as a country.
Yeah, we don't know exactly why this bill exactly came like right now. It's the Inflation Reduction Act, so principally it impacts inflation. I'm not an economist. I can't really tell you why it would lower inflation. To be honest with you,
That's the truth.
I couldn't tell you, to be honest with you, how the Fed raising rates that reduces the inflation. I guess like less money is spent or something, but I'm not an economist. I don't know. The bill though does spend a lot into, and I think that because of the Ukraine-Russia conflict and what's happening in Europe right now, I think that a lot of it is national defense related. So it's like nationalized in the U.S. production of a lot of this stuff, because right now China does a lot of the mining for a lot of the rare earth minerals. They do a lot of manufacturing of the solar panels and the wind turbines. They do a lot of it. So bringing it back to the United States kind of just making high quality American products that they can ship around the world. It's good for our economy. It's good for everything. Yeah.
Okay. So seeing as how, I would argue, and I think one of the first areas of disagreement, I think you kind of said something there that I picked up on, which is a lot of what you talked about, climate's very important. Climate change is very important because a lot of issues that have to do with our economy and things like that. That's not derivative of exactly climate change. That's our reactions to climate change. So, for example, if we could just keep drilling and keep burning, and then it wouldn't be a national security risk that we have to import rare earth materials from China, right? So it seems to me that a lot of places like the military and other areas say, well, climate change is a big problem. We have to do X, Y, and Z. But there's sort of self-imposed problems that we're creating, such as right now we are having, because we've limited ourselves with things like nuclear production, fossil fuel production, and things like that. We're now at the behest of places like Russia, China, OPEC. So I think that you're not making this claim exclusively. I think that a lot of people in positions of power do this as well. I see a lot of similarities with COVID, where they force a solution on us. That solution causes problems, and then they say, "Well, now we'll be dependent on these foreign countries for these things," and so that's why this is the biggest issue. Do you agree with that, or?
So, I mean, there's a finite amount of oil. You're right that we could just clear cut all of Alaska and just drill the whole thing down. The problem is that there's a lot of cascading impacts that has a huge impact, and these are called ecosystem services, basically. So ecosystem services are the things that the environment does for us yearly. That, like, for example, the production of oxygen. So that's actually principally done in the oceans. A lot of people think that, it's from the plants and stuff. It's 60 to 70% of the world's oxygen is actually from the ocean, diatoms and dinoflagellates and all that kind of stuff. So if we impact that environment, then that's going to have a huge impact on us. Another good example that people kind of talk about all the time are bees. If bees went extinct, then we'd have to pollinate like 70% or 80% of the plants that are that we use for food. And it's actually really interesting. There's a debate in ecology. There's a paper that came out in like 1998, 1999. I tried to quantify this, and they said like then it was like $3 or $4 trillion a year, and there was a huge pushback in the ecology field because basically every single product, everything that you look at, everything, I don't care, whoever's listening to my voice, look at any product that's around you, it all came from the environment. So it's all connected to the environment somehow. And basically, if we lose those environmental services, we're going to impact our economy, and we can't really have like a thriving economy or anything without a healthy environment.
Well, the problem is, though, that we're making a slow transition that is largely driven without government regulation, or at least government mandates, to the extent which many people on the left want. So Green New Deal type policies are spending trillions of dollars in subsidies for green energy. What ends up happening is it's bad in the short term because we're artificially limiting our economy and other things. And the bulk of the people that pay for that are always the poor and working class. And so we can see how they're going to be struggling mightily in places like California that's having brownouts and things like that, energy restrictions. For example, in Germany, the price of electricity looks like it's going up ninefold over last year. Europe is in a lot of trouble because they've been limiting themselves with sort of this environmental, social governance policies that have gotten rid of nuclear, that have gotten rid of natural gas. And that's the second part of this. What you're saying is true, obviously. We can't just cut down all the forest. We can't just say to heck with the environment. I don't think anyone reasonable believes that. But what we're seeing is that there was a gradual reduction of our impact on the environment, a gradual reduction of CO2 emissions. In fact, not even so gradual. The 2019 levels, even pre-COVID, were very optimistic. They were actually meeting our goals in the Paris Climate Accord. Conversely, so when you weigh that with, in addition to, you are right that all of these things have an effect on the environment, but so do the green technologies. For example, solar requires something like 300 times more land. Wind power famously is destroying all sorts of wildlife, such as endangered bird species. Rare earth materials come from all sorts of shady practices that come from places like China. So it sounds good to say, well, everything about fossil fuel production or energy production affects everything. Well, that's true, but so does everything else. And so I would be interested, can you quantify, like before this deal, or like going back to like 2000 till now, were we accelerating the impacts on the environment, accelerating CO2 production, or was that sort of stuff declining?
Yeah, it's actually interesting, the CO2 ppms and stuff for per capita and stuff for the United States. Actually, since 2000, it is down. It is down, and a lot of that is the shift away from coal to natural gas, basically, because coal is especially bad. Your mountaintop removal, you're doing tons of things like that, and coal is just very inefficient. And the biggest problem with electricity generation is what you're talking about. I mean, think about buying an electric vehicle and living in a place like Missouri that has 80% coal, you're basically running a friggin' coal train down the road, and you're thinking that you're actually saving the environment. So it's kind of like a dual-edged sword. You're right that the electric vehicles, electric solar panels, the rare earth minerals that are required in that, absolutely. I think I guess like, and one of the reasons why I want to talk about this kind of like idea is this centric view on CO2, ppms, and I think that this is actually somewhere that the scientific community has failed with, and I'm trying to talk to climate scientists and NASA and stuff about this, because I really feel like we've failed in our like talking about this issue, because McKinnon and all those guys are so focused on CO2, but we're ignoring 70% of animal populations are down in the last 50 years. Wetlands that have gone extinct, and 90% of them have gone extinct within the last 50 years. So this is not just like emissions. This is broader. This is way broader. This is actually how humans are negatively impacting the environment. And instead of just removing one or two species, making them go extinct, we're removing entire ecosystems. We're removing wetlands, and this is something called a trophic cascade. This is a really good example of this is Alaska. So Alaska, when they had the sea otter, the otter cap kind of thing going on, everyone was hunting sea otters. So they were killing sea otters in Alaska trying to get caps. And then all these fisheries realized that, hey, we're like running out of fish here. What's going on? Well, the sea otters eat the sea urchins, and the sea urchins eat the bottom of the base of those giant kelps. So basically, the sea otters are defending the algae and the plankton. And basically, when you remove the sea otters, now the urchins take over. They're eating all the giant kelp, and now there's no place for little fish and the little fish to kind of like grow up and protect themselves. So that's just one. That's like the best studied trophic cascade. But imagine that times like an entire ecosystem, like the wetland, which is known to be really good for fish development and all that kind of stuff. So we're kind of, just by focusing on CO2, we're kind of like missing the bigger picture, I think. So that's kind of...
Disagree. That's actually a point that I make quite often. I think that there are real environmental hazards that we can see tangibly, sometimes in our own communities. It's ironic. I think some of the best conservationists and environmentalists I've seen are hunters in my neck of the woods, because they understand and appreciate the resource of the forest, of the animals that live there. And so, many people I know that are avid hunters, not just for the entertainment of it, but because everyone's poor around here. So if you don't get a deer in winter, you're probably having a difficult time getting food through the winter. Almost everyone I know that's a hunter is an avid outdoorsman and conservationist. So there are real things that we could be overfishing, things like this. I don't think that our fossil fuel production and things like that is intertwined with everything that you're talking about there. And I think oftentimes what happens is we're so focused on this big threat of, emissions and climate change that we lose sight of the little things that we could do that wouldn't drastically change our way of life, that could make the environment locally and even globally better. And so I don't know that that's a case for why we should be spending trillions on fighting climate change. I think that it kind of makes the case against that we focus on this big thing, that this big threat that everyone has, and the very people that are focused on it lose sight of the actual tangible things that we could be doing. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We could certainly come back to this. I wanted to start by asking you sort of, if things continued apace, like let's say that this bill was never passed or that it's ineffectual at reducing emissions, and we continue on a sort of trajectory that the IPCC and others have suggested, how bad do you think the impacts of climate change will be in, say, the next 100 years? And how long do we have to drastically change our way of life to stave off those impacts?
Yeah, I mean, that's a question that really nobody can answer, I'd say. I mean, only Siths and non-scientists talk in absolutes. So I can't tell you, I
You have
think,
to, but here's why it's important. There has to be some. I'm not going to hold you to an exact thing,
yeah,
but there has to be a ballpark answer because we outlined at the beginning, which is why I wanted to do this. That to many people, this is the premier issue in the world. So much so that we're spending trillions of dollars. And
yeah,
I'm going to argue that the policies and the money we're spending causes inflation, and it almost always harms poor and working class people because cheap fossil fuels and cheap energy in the short term is always going to benefit and help poor and working class people more than the wealthy elite. The wealthy elite, like Stephen Colbert said, they could pay $15 a gallon for gas. They won't care. And so if we're going to justify giving the government massive amounts of control to spend massive portions of our GDP, saying that it affects everything from, the roads we travel on to our forests to even our military, there has to be some sort of idea of how this is a catastrophic thing. And we have to be able to quantify it in some way, or else I would say that it's a grift, that people are just nebulously fear-mongering because trillions of dollars are being made and controls being given, and it's leading to a large wealth transfer from the poor and working class to the wealthy.
yeah. I mean, it's the, what could we lose? Everything. We could lose our entire economy. We could lose our national sovereignty if people didn't think that this was actually, being dealt with. Our country could, implode based off of scarcity and fighting and civil war and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it could be as bad as people think it is, but when that could happen, I don't know.
But
Would it
is
be
there data that
confounding?
Well, right, but here's the problem, right? Like, so for example, I'm slightly familiar, and I thought that you'd be very familiar with a lot of it. Like, I'm slightly familiar with predictions that the IPCC has made, right? And they've said over the next 100 years, they anticipate about a 1 degree Celsius increase in temperature. I don't know exactly how they came to that number, though. Is that assuming that all the levels stay the same? Are they predicting some levels increase, etc.? I don't know. I've seen that they estimate that could cost between $3 to $5 trillion a year in addition to what we have to deal with those sorts of impacts. Now, that's just one group's prediction, but it's going to be tough for. This is where I think that there's this sort of disconnect. Everyone says, when it comes to conservatives and people like me that kind of push back against climate change rhetoric, oh, you don't believe climate change exists. That's not true. I absolutely do. You don't believe humans have anything to do with it. Absolutely, I believe humans have something to do with it, probably a lot to do with it, or at least a significant portion. But that's about where the consensus ends. If I'm going, governments do this all the time, right? This was what they did with the Patriot Act. They said, listen, there's a threat out there. It's terrorism, and it could get nuclear, it could get biological weapons, right? It's terrible. There's this threat out there. And so therefore, we're justified in taking all of this control of your freedom. And it's going to cost you a lot of your Fourth Amendment rights and things like that. And then when you're like, well, what specifically are you looking at? Where's the specific threat? And they're like, we don't know about that, but you could lose your country. That's what this sounds like to me. It's like, well, we don't have specifics, but trust us. And that's going to get doubly worse when I could point to this same sort of rhetoric since the 60s, same sort of people saying, we're entering an ice age, we're entering global cooling, acid rain's going to kill us all. And so there has to be something more than just, well, we kind of feel that it could get bad. Like, where's the tangible evidence of it?
I mean, so it's interesting, the ice age and the global cooling thing. I love primary sources, and I've tried to track this down. And there actually was never really a scientific consensus that was actually happening. What I can point to, and the biggest thing that I found was like a U.S. News and World Report thing. If you could find anything, that'd be amazing. But it's like a U.S. News and World Report thing that people were talking about, and people kind of drummed up, and it was never kind of like what ecologists or the scientific community really broadly thought, that there's going to be a global cooling event. It was kind of there was a stagnation and a kind of like downward trend for a little bit, but whether or not that's like global cooling, that's the problem. So
for example, the New York Times Book Review, July 18th, 1976 writes, the cooling. Stephen Snyder, a young climatologist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, reflecting on the consensus of the climatological community in his new book, The Genesis Strategy, where he warns of global cooling. He says, in 1974, Schneider and Bryson explained to the White House policymaking group why conditions are likely to worsen. It's likely to get cooler. One of the most depressing anecdotes in the book is Schneider's description of the deaf ear their warnings received. I have articles that cite NASA, a consensus from NASA that we're entering an ice age from the early 70s. I could link you a bunch of this. There's websites that compile actual newspaper articles and books. Now, I think the term you use there that I think's interesting is the term consensus, because I would argue that we don't have a consensus today. For example, this is something that's near and dear to you. In fact, so much so that it's the reason you got into the field you're in. Yet you can't give me any specific that says we're predicting emissions will do this, which will cause these harms, and therefore we need to reduce emissions by this point. Not the specific numbers necessarily to the T, but you haven't even really given a ballpark idea. If there was a consensus, right, then that data would be out there. But there isn't a consensus. Instead, what there is there's a consensus the climate is changing. There's a consensus humans have something to do with it. But that's where the consensus fails. There's no consensus on how bad it'll get. There's no consensus on what we need to do about it, how much we need to reduce emissions. And so similarly, when your criticism of, well, when NASA and the National Institute of Climatologists said we were entering a cooling period in the 70s, you're like, well, there wasn't a consensus. Probably true, but there's not a consensus today either, at least on the important things, such as how bad will it get and what do we need to do about it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm working on my research deals with like dealing with climate change. So figuring out how to, remedy it through, solutions and researching the solutions rather than actually figuring out CO2 ppms and when it's actually going to peak. And I mean, anyone that is going to give you like a projection, 10, 20, 30 years from now, it's all relying on modeling and whether or not you actually agree with that modeling anyway. People dispute that. So it doesn't really behoove anyone to really go down those roads, in my opinion. What we can agree on by far, and why it is a scientific consensus, is how many different fields all are saying at the same time that these things are going very poorly and these are going down, the path of no return. And they all integrate human activity into them. So, we're talking about ocean acidification. We're talking about endosymbiotic zooxanthellae, which are the living organisms inside coral. They're leaving the coral. So this is like causing coral bleaching. We're talking about, ice caps melting. We're talking about global sea rising. We're talking about mass migrations of animals to higher elevations and more northern latitudes so that they can, live in cooler areas. We're talking about phylogeny, which is the timing of nature. So basically insects and flowers, they're not matching up anymore because basically the seasons are kind of not lining up and, they're not spawning at the same time anymore. We could go on and on. There's, we're talking about population numbers of animals. So like looking at a graph of CO2 ppms, that's very specific. And I understand why the conversation has been focused on that because the scientific community has been kind of focusing on that. I kind of think that people are smarter than that and I'm trying to create a discussion that's a little bit more broad than that. Even if the CO2 ppm goes down, and we've completely wrecked the environment and we don't have any, a healthy ecosystem, then we're screwed. And we know that healthy ecosystems are two things in ecology. We know this really well. Lots of species and lots of animals. So we need a lot of different types of species, biodiversity, and we need a lot of those animals in order to have robust genomes, lots of mutations so that they can survive this. And both are going down. So we could talk about a lot of the negative impacts without even talking about CO2 ppms and trying to graph and model that kind of stuff. And it's just
but again, those things have been going down since we've been recording, right? And in some metrics, they're actually increasing. For example, one of the things you mentioned was coral. Just a couple months ago, there were reports that the Great Barrier Reef, large sections of it, recorded its highest coral production in the past 36 years. This was despite dire predictions that said that the Barrier Reef would cease to exist if we continued without doing these sort of drastic change policies. This occurs all over the place. We hear that the experts say things like flooding's increasing around the world, but that's just because people are living closer to water areas than they had in the past. And actually, the amount of flooding and the amount of hurricanes and the amount of droughts and the amount of things like that caused by the climate, even though we're told that they're massively increasing, it turns out that that's not always the case. Sometimes it is, but many times it's not. For example, scientists were predicting this previous summer, because of climate change, we are going to see one of the worst hurricane seasons. Instead, we saw one of the mildest. And the reason this is important, because these specifics, anytime that we're having a conversation about something that's benign, like, so for example, no, I don't want to say benign, that's not the right word. Let's say we're talking about a problem that doesn't require a lot of sacrifice for the solution. And so, for example, let's say you said to me, the biggest issue in the world is climate change, and the one thing that we need to do to stop it is you need to stop drinking Coca-Cola products. I could do that. I would say, okay, that's not a big deal. But instead, what we're being told is you have to spend trillions of dollars, and poor and working class people are going to suffer the brunt of this the most. And in the United States, that'll mean that you might have to experience brownouts, and you might have to buy a vehicle that poor and working class people won't be able to afford. And in Europe, that means that small businesses are going to shutter because the costs are going up 9 times for electricity. And that might mean that we have to make sacrifices in places like India, where cheap fossil fuels have actually increased life expectancy by dozens of years, or by about a dozen years. Sorry, those people are going to have to go away from that. We're not suggesting that this is something that has an easy solution. Instead, the solution is trillions upon trillions of dollars, which will come at the expense and the sacrifice of poor and working class people. And so I just don't buy, well, we can see that, there are environments that are being affected. Right, that's true. There always have been, but there are always things we could do to come back. The question becomes, why do we need these authoritarian policies and spending trillions of dollars if the status quo is gradually making these things better? And so in order to argue that, you would need to argue, one, that things are so bad that we can't just let the status quo or small policies. We need these giant, massive policies like the $500 billion spending. And secondly, that's not going to cause things that are problematic, and that the pain won't be outweighed by the benefit, or the pain won't outweigh the benefit. And when it comes to diagnosing the threat, I just don't see anything tangible, like from talking to you, that I could hang my hat on that I would say, yep, absolutely, I'm willing to suffer extreme poverty now because, of something you've said here.
Yeah, I don't think that, suffering extreme poverty should be like on the table. I don't, there's a lot of, what I think the problem is that a lot of people see that the train's going off the cliff, and this is like the chance to tack on a lot of ideological solutions and stuff like that. And we have to do things like, I hear crazy things like we have to overthrow world capitalism in order to fight climate change and that kind of stuff. And it's like, I mean, that's crazy, man, because I'm just trying to solve climate change. That's another problem that you're tagging onto it. That's even crazier. So even bigger, and it's like there are a lot of solutions out there that would not even change people's every day that could have a huge impact. Like, for example, something that's been invested in heavily in the Inflation Reduction Act is algae biofuels. I'm biased. I've worked in this field for 10 years, but it's and you're talking about the cost is too high in order to buy an electronic vehicle, and I totally agree with you. Actually, by the way, a lot of people that I know don't even want to buy a car or have a car, and now we're being told we have to buy another car, like in a specific car. So I think that the cost of ownership of an electronic vehicle is being subsidized and all that kind of stuff. But still, I think that the only way for me to, for example, make my 92 Ford Ranger, a sustainable renewable fuel car is by algae biofuels. You can actually, just take out, the fats or the lipids, which are the thing that we use in the gasoline, and just put it right into, a regular combustion engine, and it works fine. And we're talking about, the carbon footprint of me not having to buy a full new car versus, using an existing one. I mean, this would be a huge advantage, and we can actually already use a lot of the existing infrastructure that we would have. So this is the gas, the tanks, the gas stations, the gas lines, all that kind of stuff. We could already use that with algae biofuels, because if you're not aware, the gasoline that we already use is basically 300 to 400 million year old plants and algae that were basically the weight of the earth is sitting on it, and that kind of disrupts all the cell membranes so that it becomes just like one black tar kind of thing. And then the oil companies go and remove that and then extract the oils, and then that's what gasoline is. And those 85, 87 is actually the length of carbon chains that exist already in there. So that is a solution that is coming, and that's probably going to be the more practical solution, by the way, in the future for airplane travel, because like electric vehicles, it's impossible to do a 747 electronically. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. There's just not enough thrust. So again, like that's why a lot of the air transportation industry is kind of going in that direction. And we've already done like a 747 with an algae biofuels like mixture too. So there's a lot of solutions in that.
Two things to say about that. If the solutions are so easy, then I think a lot of the authoritarian policies, such as a lot of the things that were in the Green New Deal, a lot of things that we see occurring in Europe and spending trillions of dollars, don't seem, if the solutions are that close, it seems like those things are unwarranted then. And secondly, this sounds very similar. So when I debated in college in 2004, one of the topics was the Kyoto Protocol. And it had to do with climate change. This was a protocol that I think in 97 that talked about reducing 1990 level emissions by 18% globally by the year 2020. The U.S. signed on and then withdrew under George Bush. Canada famously withdrew in like 2011. But this was sort of the precursor to the Paris Climate Accord. So in that debate topic, we talked a lot about alternative fuels and we talked about ethanol. There was something, God, I forget the name of it. It was like some form of switchgrass. It was the new thing. I listened to some guy talk just like you're talking now, like this is going to solve all the problems between ethanol and this form of switchgrass. Trust us, this is going to solve it. But the problems were that, as you know, with ethanol, that it was very, very much preemptive to say that it was going to solve things. So, for example, it wasn't as efficient. It was going to require massive amounts of farmland. It would have massively lowered food production. So it sounds good. I can't speak on the specifics of it. I hope you're right. A cheap prevalent fuel would be great. But, there are probably problems that will come in the future, such as how much will this be able to affect our global energy consumption going from strictly algae? What sort of land mass will be required to do it? What sort of production will be necessary? Will fossil fuels be necessary or rare earth materials in the production and things like that? So I think we've heard this song and dance many, many times, but, I'm not optimistic that it'll be as easy as you say, because we've heard this same sort of language since the 90s.
Yeah, that's I love it. So ethanol is one of those things. So we're talking about basically what happens is the plants make sugars from photosynthesis from the sun. Then they take those sugars and they give it to yeast, and then the yeast create the ethanol, and then the ethanol is used in our cars. Right now, the Clinton administration passed a 10% by volume mandatory use for ethanol in our gas. And you're right, it actually is less, it's less energy dense than regular gas. So it actually just dilutes our gas. And it's crazy, man. Like, so 40% of our corn that's grown in the United States is used for this, for that 10% of our gas. And I mean, only 10% of our corn is actually used for eating, by the way. The majority of it is actually used for feed for livestock. So it's, livestock, corn ethanol, and then for plastics and stuff. And then lastly, for food production. So the difference between like a plant and an algae is that an algae is basically one big, chloroplast. A plant has like a lot of different things, structures, stems, a lot of energy that it uses that isn't actually for, the actual thing that we need, which is the fat, which is the lipids and that kind of stuff. So that's why algae is so much more efficient than that's why algae is so much more efficient than a plant. I think it's like 300 or 400% more efficient per acre. If you take, and it's really interesting in 2010, when I got into this industry, it was basically an algae pond the size of Texas that was needed in order to create all of the national production for the United States to make all of our fuel renewably. Now it's gotten to about the size of Montana. So it's decreased significantly. And then on top of that, it's actually coincidental that amount of space is actually Montana is actually the size of all the corn fields in the United States. So if you think about that, you think about 40% of Montana is being used just for 10% of our oil, our gas, excuse me. Meanwhile, we could use that same 40% of Montana and actually use 40% of, and it would actually decrease, it would actually produce 40% of our total gas that was needed for the entire country. So it's like we're kind of just in this losing.
I'm sorry, what was the percent there? Sorry, I missed that. What was the percent you said it would produce?
So the entire state of Montana would be algae biofuels for the entire country to be 100% renewable, no foreign imports of oil. So instead of using that 40% for corn, we could use that 40% to just do 40% of our entire gas production. It would be massive, a massive thing going forward. But we're kind of like
what sort of government monies would be net? Because here's the problem: like, businesses are smart sometimes in ways that I don't like. I find many of these corporations irk me, that I think that are exploiting sort of average people. But they're smart and they know how to make money, and they could see the future. Even if they don't care about climate change, they could see the tea leaves enough to say, here's an investment opportunity. And so if everything is as simple as you say, why does it require massive government spending? Wouldn't some prolific businessman say, wow, here's an option. We could use this land to start getting an incredible share of the fossil fuel market. This is something that's easy to achieve. It'll be much cheaper after initial startup costs than drilling for oil and things like that. And the reason I bring this up is I'm skeptical. I'm very skeptical that it's as easy, and I have reason to be skeptical because, again, will you at least admit I see that you're differentiating between ethanol and switchgrass and things like that, but will you admit that people talked about it as optimistically as you're talking now?
Oh yeah, people still do.
All that ended up happening, it made a bunch of people rich. It diluted our gasoline. It lowered our food production, which probably hurt people around the world in countries that we export to. But we didn't really see any of the benefits. In fact, we've seen far more benefits from natural gas, from even clean coal technology. Those things have benefited our environment far more than ethanol has. So the people that are demanding these $1 trillion, us restricting our rights and stuff, the same sort of people have misled us before, got incredibly wealthy, and either harmed or had no benefit to us. So it's difficult for me to just believe it this time.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. People still talk about ethanol. It's called cellulosics, trying to basically take the used cellulose and the corn stalks after they've taken the everything from them, and then trying to convert that that old plant matter that's usually just composted and that kind of stuff, and trying to convert that somehow into usable energy and that kind of thing. It's a huge industry because the corn industry is very strong in the United States, and the ethanol lobby is really strong. But I think that you're talking about something that goes back to what I was talking about before, where it's like what you identified correctly is that there's a huge gap, right? And what I'm saying is that the technologies already exist for us to help solve this problem. That basically we have it at the research scale, we have it at the pilot scale, we have algae raceways and that kind of thing, and we need basically to figure out how we can scale it up from just that pilot plant to like a national level, a huge thing. And that does cost a lot of time and money. And you're right. There are business opportunities here, which is why, like, for example, ExxonMobil has invested heavily into algae biofuels for, the Craig Venner in San Diego with synthetic genomics. I think they've done like $700 million a couple times now. So they spent over $1 billion in research on this. Some people say it's PR. I think it's legit. I think that it's legit science that's going on, and they're actually putting a lot of money behind it. But yeah,
well, good, and that's sort of part of my point, right? Like, so when we look at the trending of environmentalism, particularly when it comes to CO2 emissions, shares of renewables, things like that, cleaner technology in the form of natural gas versus coal, nuclear, etc. We can see that that's all trending in the right way without massive government intervention. And what we see is almost every time that the government mandates a massive intervention, it has the exact opposite effect. And the people that always pay the price are always the poor and working class people. So, for example, in Germany, There was a lot of things in the past 10, 15 years, people saying climate change is a big deal. We need to transition to renewables, etc. Germany burned more fossil fuels and had more emissions in the past 2 years than they did even previous to many of these initiatives. And the reason why was they did things like they shut down clean nuclear power. They stopped, and all throughout Europe, they stopped clean natural gas. So the problem is, because of the dire threat of climate change, they've artificially accelerated and forced changes faster than they would have naturally occurred. You're admitting, right? Yes, we don't have a time frame that says if we don't solve it by this point, we're all screwed. And there is a natural transition occurring. In fact, businesses are spending billions of dollars in the one issue that you're talking about with algae, and they've spent billions of dollars without the government on a bunch of other renewable technologies as well. My problem isn't the renewables. My problem is the government forcing of them. And just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, we are in a global famine right now. We're in a global recession. People are struggling mightily, mostly because of policies that the government made. The same sorts of people that want to make decisions about and have the government control decisions about our energy. They made the decision to lock us down in the United States and all around the world, which harmed the economy, which then they printed trillions of dollars, which caused inflation, etc. One of the things they're doing in places like Europe is, in the second largest food exporting country of the Netherlands, in order to fight climate change, they're shutting down livestock producers. They're also limiting fertilizers because they say that that will help fight climate change. So at the exact time that we have a global recession or possibly depression in some areas and a famine that's occurring, we are making decisions to shut down farming, increase the cost of fertilizers or diminish the use of fertilizers, and print trillions of dollars. Why do we need the government intervening if things are trending in this way without these government interventions?
Good questions. So interesting, like the global famine, it's interesting you brought that up because it leads into exactly what we were talking about before. Is because of that 10% cost of for our gas, the Clinton administration basically for the first time tied food costs, which of food of corn, to our gas prices. So they've kind of like risen. If you look at like a bushel of corn prices before and after that, it's just been haywire since. So it's awful what that is. And I would totally support repealing that, just for the record. Nuclear power. I think that, there's a lot of different ways to get involved or get combat this problem. And if someone's like pro-nuclear or they're really interested and they're really interested in that research, go for it. I'm not anti-nuclear at all. I think that it's a really important way to generate electricity in really highly densely populated areas. So like for places like maybe the East Coast, maybe places like Japan, countries like Japan, these are, nuclear power is a very good way in order to do it. It's just not renewable, and which is the biggest problem. There are things called like breeder reactors or seed reactors that have said that they were going to be renewable, but they basically the international nuclear governing agencies and stuff just haven't said that it's efficient enough in order to be classified as nuclear. But that research should continue going. I'm totally for that. And then.
Well, you said, if I could say something you said earlier that sort of goes in line with this, is sort of the scarcity of non-renewables. So, for example, fossil fuels, that there is a scarcity. But as you probably know, there were people saying in the late 90s, we hit peak oil.
Yeah.
Right. I remember I debated it all the time. Right. In fact, it was one of the affirmatives that I ran, that we hit peak oil in about 2002. And within 10 years, we were doomed. And then fracking came along and all these other things. And it turned out that, we weren't even close to peak oil. So I think you're technically right. And I don't know the specifics about this. I don't think that I would consider nuclear renewable in the sense that something like algae would be renewable. But are you aware of any like limitations? Like, are there people out there saying, we can only, if we decided to totally go ham on nuclear, we would only have enough material to, increase our reactors by 10%? I'm unaware of. To me, it seems like we are imposing artificial restrictions, not restrictions based on the non-availability of the resources necessary.
Yeah, nuclear energy is basically you start running into the problems that like electric vehicles have. You're generating electricity, but now cars need to be electric. And I'm not saying that there's going to be one solution for all that kind of stuff, but I'm just saying if there was a way to generate electricity, per, kilowatt hour, the, wind and solar seems to be a lot more efficient and cheaper over time. So, and I wouldn't say that there's a scarcity of oil. There isn't. We have a lot of it in reserves. It's just that, like, if it's precious now, it's going to be even more precious in the future probably. And in order to do that, in order to use that, we're just going to be indebting ourselves into that problem going forward. So, I mean, just to be clear, combustion engines right now, the problem is not the combustion engine inherently, right? It's actually the fact that we're actually taking carbon from the earth and then exporting it to the atmosphere. And that's the biggest problem. But if you actually take down CO2 from the atmosphere and then emit it back into the atmosphere, the biggest problem is the carbon footprint in order to make that oil then, right? It's taking the algae and then refining it and making it into the oil, which right now is actually trying to remove the water, basically the chemical reactions in order to isolate the lipids or the fats. They don't work well with water. So it's like, that's where all the tech dev is actually going in right now. Kind of interesting.
So I just think I have to. One thing you said there, you said
Yeah.
that wind and solar would be cheaper. That's just fundamentally not true. Nuclear is one of the cheapest forms of electricity, both in the short and long term. So, for example, some of the things that are required for wind and solar, you need about 300 times more land, 300% more copper, 700% more rare earth. That's just in fossil fuels. You need 1,000% more steel, concrete, and glass, 4,200, 2,500, 1,900, and 700% more lithium, graphite, nickel, and rare earths. That's just in fossil fuels, and nuclear is many times.
So so for we're talking about fracking. Then we're talking about CNG.
Yeah, it was fossil fuels in general.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, fracking. It's kind of interesting. I mean, there's limitations to fracking. A lot of people have. There's a lot of. A lot of land rights problems that happen with horizontal fracking. Fracking's actually been, people kind of talk about it like as this boogeyman, but fracking's been around for a really long time. It's just the what is it, in the 90s, I think, the kind of expansion of the use of horizontal fracking that has really expanded throughout the United States. So there's been vertical fracking for a really long time. There's people that now have wells and stuff that are now being polluted and things like that. And, yeah, I mean, that's a thing. I mean, I'm going by the kilowatt hour thing by the IPCC report. The latest one, talks about the cost of, developing and using nuclear versus solar and wind, and it identified it there. I haven't looked at the exact numbers that you're talking about, but I can see why, more rare earth minerals is needed in a solar and wind because it's generating electricity and you have to store that energy, right? Which is the whole point of a battery. A fossil fuels or compressed natural gas, it's called a fungible fuel. So a fungible fuel is when you actually store the energy within the bonds of the molecules itself. So that it has the same thing with biofuels. It's the same thing with any type of gasoline, right? You could take that at any elevation. You could take that to space, and they would have the same. Those molecules would be there. They would have the same contacts that are made, but a battery is just basically a change in proton gradient. So you could think of a battery even like as a dam, right? You could see like the water being pulled back. You could see the electrons or the protons being stopped. Battery technology is kind of like this whole thing that people say like, oh, we need it for it to get better in order for us to get to solve these problems with climate change. I kind of don't agree with that sentiment. I think that we have the technology now that we can use to help solve some of this stuff. But I'd like to.
Okay.
I'd like
I was just going to say real quick.
Go ahead.
You want to talk about the Reduction Act?
I wanted to talk about you said multiple times about that renewable fuels hurts poor and working class, and I just wanted to talk about that specifically. I think it's admirable what you're talking about, and I agree that like any type of huge change would need to focus on not impacting the most marginalized people in our society. I totally agree. in my experience in biotech and working in these companies, a lot of these the new manufacturing jobs that are going to be made because of the IRA, a lot of the biotechnology companies that are being spun up from a lot of the research that's being spent in this space. A lot of those jobs are at all different levels. So they're not just all PhDs that are in there. They're not all, MBAs that are staffing there. I worked there with an undergraduate degree, and there's lots of different people. It was a plant, company, right? So we had a lot of people at the greenhouses, and these jobs are, they're tech jobs, right? They actually pay really well. They have good benefits. They're renewable. You're making something that you're proud of, that you're actually contributing, and you feel like, hey man, we're doing a good thing. And I'm really excited actually to have like the United States manufacturing jobs coming back to the United States and having it be in 21st century technology that's going to be around for a while. That's really going to be things that you can build a family off of, and salaries that can pay that.
Here's the problem with that. The same could be true of fracking. The same could be true of coal mining. Like these jobs, clearly, there are a litany of jobs that spread from those sorts of industries. And the problem I have is this: anytime you have the government massively intervening in it's sort of a natural thing, such as energy production, they're always going to be less efficient with helping out the people that need the help the most than if you allow a natural process to occur. So let's assume that you're right. Like, I don't have an apples to apples comparison, and I wouldn't expect you to have either, of how many jobs will we lose from the fossil fuel industry, like my friends that work in oil rigs, or my friends that are coal miners, or my friends that are frackers. How many of them will lose jobs versus how many more will be created through algae farming or creating solar panels or something of that nature? I don't know. But what I do know is this: when I say that I'm not just talking about jobs when I'm talking about poor and working class people. I'm talking about the quality of life in the form of economic situation. So how much you'll have to pay for energy and how much energy you'll be able to consume. So, for example, in the United States, do you have a guess which state has the highest share of their electricity through renewables?
California.
Right. And they're paying more for electricity. Their emissions have been rising, and they're experiencing things like brownouts. Mm-hmm. Now, the wealthy could get through this. They always will. The people that will, I mean, and I don't know if you remember this. I don't know how old you are. Do you remember
36.
The Enron situation?
Oh, yeah.
I'm 38. Okay.
I live in California.
Okay, so with Enron, I don't know if people know this. The younger people might just remember, oh, they were corrupt. One of the things Enron did was they bought shares in like power companies, and then they told them to shut them off. Do you remember this? Like, they would call the power companies. And this was the first time I heard of this. People die. Mm-hmm. When the power goes off, people die, because we think, me and my bubble as a 20-something-year-old back then, it was like, the power goes out at my house for a week. I lose all the food in the fridge and I'm a little sweety. Mm-hmm. But what if you're on oxygen? What if you're an older person with COPD? What if you're in, you need a heat controlled environment? People literally die. Those are the people that are on the fringes, the people that are the most vulnerable. They're the ones that pay the most. And this isn't open for debate. We could see it occurring right now. In Germany, for example, which has made an effort to have a huge percent, to increase the percentage of their renewables, so much so that they shut down their only nuclear plant in the name of, worshiping at the altar of Greta Thunberg and fighting climate change. Now it's the poor and working class and the individual business owners that are suffering immensely. They're about to enter a hellish winter, and it's going to be not quite as bad, but it'll be bad in many parts of the United States as well. And I just don't see, I think that it's undoubtable that the people that make sacrifices when we have the government massively take away things like, well, you can no longer have cheap fossil fuels, it's the poor and working class that'll pay. And I'll put it to you this way, and we'll see if you agree or disagree. Would you agree that if it was more profitable for companies to have renewables right now and they were workable, that they would be doing them? They would be, right? Like, they just care about making the dollar, basically, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I mean, but the problem is that you're not calculating in that the amount of money that we subsidize the oil industry for. I mean, tens of billions of dollars every year goes to the oil companies, even though it's the most profitable industry of all time. And it's just like, so it's frustrating for me as like someone that's in that space. It's like, man, they're not making a product. it's important to realize that an oil company has their product already made, and they just drill for it, they extract it, they refine the product, and then give it to you. Us over here in algae biofuels, we have to make those carbon chains. We have to make the oil first, and then we have to refine it. Then we have to package it. So, they already have their product, and they're just basically drilling for it. I mean, just imagine Apple or any of these other companies drilling for Apple, the phone 15 or something. It's like, oh, we found the next generation, guys. It's like, we have to do a lot of work in order to do that. So it's kind of like a hard comparison. So we're kind of we're incentivizing the one that's cheap, the easiest, and you're right that it is, it is more expensive for renewables in a lot of these places, but that's what kind of, again, the point of the IRA and everything is to kind of try to take it from that scale where it's still kind of expensive and niche to kind of the larger scale where now it's a lot cheaper for, and California just passed a bill that actually was $60 billion for renewable generation. So to help with, costs of living and reduce energy bills in general.
You can see, we're talking about this. I mean, again, let's be quite clear. There are a lot of things, not just the algae or not just the Inflation Reduction Act, that are being done in the name of fighting climate change, such as the fertilizers. We're massively restricting our food production in the time of a global famine. We can see that it is poor and working class people that will suffer, because wealthy people don't suffer like that, right? They'll be able to go somewhere that's comfortable. They're not on the verge of starving to death if they go 2 weeks without electricity. They'll be able to have mobility to leave, to buy generators, things like that. It's the poor and working class that'll shutter their business, that won't be able to go to work, that will suffer both physical and economic ramifications, and to a lesser extent, but still true, psychological ramifications of this. And if you doubt that, try to be in a house without electricity in a Pennsylvania Lake Erie cold night, or in some areas of Phoenix County.
There's no reason for that. I totally agree.
I agree with you that I do have problems with fossil fuel subsidies. I don't agree with your exact characterization that they're just taking something and, I think they do a lot, just like we would say that people refine other natural resources. I think that they are doing refinement and stuff, but I agree subsidies are problematic, and that could be stopping a transition to other forms of economically competitive forms of renewables and things like that. But I just want to ask you straight out then.
Before you go for a question,
go ahead.
Can I just want to talk about, you mentioned multiple times the farmers and the runoff and stuff. I thought this is actually a really interesting point, and why this is actually where the lab that I'm in actually is researching directly on this. Basically, the cause of this is that the nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium runoffs from farms gets into waterways, and then it goes and gets out into the ocean, and then it causes these algae blooms. Algae die, and when they die, there's basically a huge lack of oxygen in that area, and it's called oxygen minimal zones. And these oxygen minimal zones are off the coast of every single city in the entire world. And this is actually what those news reports are. If you see thousands of fish died on the beach, and we don't have any reason why, it's a huge pool of school of fish went and swam into these things and died. Whether or not we need to legislate that is kind of in a different point, but how the research that I'm in ties in directly, though, is we're figuring out how through nanotechnology, in order to deliver nutrients as plants need it, where they need it in their cells. So maybe instead of flooding them with nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, what if we used a nanoparticle and tied some phosphorus, some nitrogen to it, and then put it right into the cell organelle part of the plant that needs it the most? So maybe we could actually decrease the amount of fertilizer that we use. Maybe we could decrease the amount of runoff, through new technologies and stuff like that.
Well, maybe. And again, but here's the part that I want to get to, right? So we'll table the Inflation Reduction Act. We'll get to it in a second. But other things that we've seen that have been enacted recently, or proposals enacted recently to fight climate change, I just want to get if you're in favor of these or not. So, for example, the banning of gas-powered cars in California by 2035. Is that something you're in favor of?
That's actually something that the DOE in general is actually going for, going to. I mean, in general, recently bought a new car, and it was an electric vehicle. So, I don't feel like, electric vehicles, there is a gas credit in the IRA for new electric vehicles. But it's just more, I don't know. I mean, to be honest with you, if you want the hot take, like, I don't even like electric vehicles that much in general. I'm actually not a huge fan of it, because there are tons of battery waste that's being generated because of it, and it's just basically creating an all new infrastructure system that we need, and we need to build. New electric vehicle hot swapping stations need to be built all across the United States. There's a couple of different companies that are trying to do that, but I mean, we're talking trillions and trillions of dollars that I feel like is being forced, and it's like when we already have systems in order to deal with it, it's kind of like seems superfluous. But in general, like, the electric vehicle per mile, like, driven, is actually, for whatever reason, because of a motor being more efficient than a combustion engine, the electric vehicles they're better, per mile. It's just that they need to be driven for, a little longer than people expect. So we're talking like a little bit over 20 years in order for the carbon footprint of an electric vehicle to be kind of like evened out. So
that's a massive government intervention into people's lives that basically is negligible. At worst, it's very bad, because people don't usually drive a car for 20 years. So it actually makes emissions worse. So you would be against that in general. That's a fair statement.
I mean, I'm biased, but I'd rather that be going to like algae biofuels or something like that. Like with algae biofuels, you could literally make your own fuel in your backyard, like, for real. I mean, this is, it's not inconceivable, without, photobioreactors, stuff like that. There's a lot of solutions other than just trying to, go through it. And we have gas stations already. It just seems kind of, I don't know. It's where the science is kind of pointing, where people are taking us. But you're right. It's very disruptive to our energy grid that we already have. I don't feel like the as a scientist, I need to come into someone's life and be like, you're changing everything. We're going ground floor, and this is how you're going to live your life. I don't want to do that. I want to try to figure out how we can make, humans live renewably and sustainably without, just completely starting over from like cave dwellers. That's just, we want to keep the same quality of life and then improve on it, but like quality of life should only get better once we live more sustainably off the environment.
Well, I don't disagree with the premise that you're saying, but that's a radical departure from what we see most climate change alarmists speak of.
Yeah.
Because my contention is, again, if we go back to the beginning, I'm not contending that there aren't negative impacts to climate change. We don't know how bad they are, what exactly they are. We don't know if the natural occurrence without government intervention would be able to solve much of that. I think that it would. But nonetheless, I don't know. I'm not going to claim to be an expert on that. My problem is with the massive government intervention, which almost always is an effect on people's rights, and even as important, harms them economically, physically, in the ways that we talk. So right there, we can see some of the people that most are, the most, at least politician-wise, that are the most adamant about fighting climate change. The very first policy that comes to mind in your state, you're like, yeah, it's probably a mistake. It's great imposition to people. And again, how are poor people? You mentioned that the Inflation Reduction Act has a credit, a tax credit for people that buy electric vehicles. Yeah, that's nice if you could afford a $60,000 vehicle.
Exactly.
The median wealth in my family income in my neck of the woods is about $39,000. I can't afford that. I mean, the car I'm driving, I paid $6,000 for.
I totally
can't
agree.
afford a $60,000. And so what I'm trying to say is, and I could go through, I don't think I need to go through it, but I could go through, should we be restricting fertilizer at the time of a famine? Should we be shutting down farms at the time of famine?
Probably not.
Yeah, right. So you're going to agree with most of those things. The problem I have is then, like, can you see then how it's either incompetence by the government that's doing these things, or worse, that it's corruption, and that they're doing this because scarcity makes people easy to control. And so they're intentionally setting up situations that, even with ethanol, you admitted, ethanol was basically a huge mistake. And so that's why, given your optimism, and I'm not on the level of being able to debate the algae, the renewable algae with you. I don't know the specifics. I'll just caution, we've heard these stories before and it didn't work out as advertised. But I hope you're right. Like, I definitely do. But given that this sort of stuff's happening without massive government intervention right now, can you see the problem when the track record of the government's been be alarmist as shit and then institute policies that have the exact directly opposite effect of what they proclaim to? Could you see how someone like me would be skeptical to give the government the power to, massively cause an increase in prices in the short term, massively have more of a control over what I'm allowed to do? And I think there's a difference. I agree with you with problems with subsidies for fossil fuel, but we're not just talking about subsidies. We're talking about mandating what people could do. There are reports of mandating setting an electron thermostats that people aren't allowed to have the thermostat at certain temperatures, other sorts of restrictions that we see coming. And I think that you're making the case that that's not the right way to go. Instead of restricting, we should be changing the type of fuel, particularly with this algae. But to me, it's like, this is why we keep the government out of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so I think government intervention is good, especially for scientific things, just because research science fails. 99% of the time, your research experiment's going to fail. And that's not a very profitable venture. It's not like that's just not why research, I shouldn't say basic, I should say like fundamental research is actually not done at companies. So for example, like, Doudna had to do 20 years of research into bacterial defense mechanisms before she discovered CRISPR. And that 20 years of bacterial defense mechanisms, while really interesting papers, but that's not going to be profitable. So nobody's going to really, there's not going to be a company that's spun off of that. But once you discover CRISPR, now that can be used as a tool. Now all these companies, now thousands of companies have sprung up using that tool that was researched and developed at a public university. Now people, and I worked at a company that was doing genome engineering when CRISPR came out. I'm actually the one that went to the company and was like, we need to start using this, and they were like, this is incredible. This is going to be able to to make mutants a lot quicker, and So it's important to realize that like biotechnology companies aren't doing the novel fundamental research themselves, and a lot of the basic research, a lot of the fundamental research, it just fails. So that's why you just incentivize it through government subsidies, because there can be those breakthrough moments that are just like exactly like CRISPR.
Let me ask you a question, because I don't know a lot about CRISPR. I have heard that this had a lot to do with government subsidies and government funding that went into research. Do you have a ballpark idea of like how much money went into that from the government?
Funding Doudna for all those years?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good question.
And here's why I ask, because this isn't a gotcha, and by no means should you know this. Yeah. I was just curious, because the reason I asked is because we started off, and we're going to get to the Inflation Reduction Act here, unprecedented kind of spending. Yeah. When it comes to climate change is what we're seeing now. Oh, yeah. So my question is, let's say let's say that over the decade and a half, 2 decades that it was being funded, maybe.
I'd say probably $1 million a year, or $500,000 maybe.
Right. Okay, so then we were able to have this massively beneficial technology that might be able to change how we're doing all sorts of things in the future. And we're talking maybe $1 billion, right? But what we're talking about if $1 million a year, you said, I mean, that would be far less than $1 billion. So I'm just taking.
But a biotechnology company is doing like $1 million a month, man. I mean, but yeah. Okay. I mean, okay.
Nonetheless, we're talking about $500 billion in new spending just recently here, right? Just from the Inflation Reduction Act bill and the other bill that you mentioned. That's $500 billion. This is occurring at time of massive inflation, which again, who is it harming? It's not harming Stephen Colbert. It's not harming most of the people that are climate scientists, right? Because they're probably making more money. It's harming mom and pop shops. It's harming the average person that's living paycheck to paycheck. And so given that, like, it seems that our area of contention, I don't want to say, it seems we have more agreement than I anticipated on sort of the restrictive policies that we see around the government, around the world, such as you can't use combustion engines. You can't use these fertilizers. It seems we agree that that's wrong. You might not think it's nefarious as me. I think it's intentional. I think that they're creating scarcity. But nonetheless, we agree those policies are wrong. So now we get to the Inflation Reduction Act, and you're going to say, well, this is good. It's not as restrictive. And, spending this money could lead to good things like CRISPR. But my contention is, in the time of an inflation, why are we spending $500 billion on this massive subsidy that, when you're like, for far, far less, for, pennies on the dollar, we had this massive changing technology that's going to be able to change things.
I mean, part of it is national security, because like what we were talking about before, basically the forward import of oil, which is, something that we are at peak, like exporting of, but before I go, I don't know. Don't quote me on the number for Dowd and his lab. I laugh because like you bring in one of the secret problems with science funding is that you go and you get that $1 million grant. Finally, you get that award from NSF and all that kind of stuff. And you get half of it taken away from you by the University of California because they're like, oh, you need to, you need to pay for rent. You need to pay for all that kind of stuff. So it's like how much that she actually went through. I don't know how big her team was. I mean, you're looking at a postdoc, which is someone with a PhD that does training after their PhD. You're looking at them getting paid about $40,000 a year. A PhD student you need to be paying about $22,000 a year, and that's a lot of that cost is actually fronted by the PhD student by teaching, and then they're like most labs aren't getting those big grants. Not most of them are kind of just they're kind of like meant to go and get their own money kind of like as an independent like researcher, and how you do as a researcher is bet on getting those grants in. So it's kind of it is hard. It's like a motley crew of funding.
And let me adjust something I said. I'm not implying that someone like you, that's, as a PhD student that's working on something, that you're making like hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's not what I'm saying. Yeah. I'm talking about the people that are sort of at the heads of those labs and things like that.
They're not making that much. The University of California, all those that professor stuff is all public. You can look it up, and they're making $140,000 a year, which in California for a tech job for their that's not that much money. I mean, in California and for their level.
But still, I mean, when you compare, even with the massive price increase, largely due to energy costs and things like that as well in California from terrible policies, around here, the median income, like household income's like $39,000-$40,000. Yeah. And so this is the problem with inflation. And I'm not saying this to be rude, right? Because I fall into the same criticism that I'm about to make of you. We tend to focus on the issues that are important to us in a bubble somewhat, right? Like, for example, if you were if you're a or a virologist, when you're like, well, what do we do about COVID? You're looking at it like, well, we need to solve the virus. You're not thinking, well, how will this harm children, that aren't going to schools? How will this harm small businesses, right? And for you, I think when you're looking at this through like sort of the renewable that you're working on, right? That's sort of the lens you're viewing it through. So it's like, let's send 500. right. And I'm biased as well when it comes to my big issue is corruption, right? And I'll even go further than that. I'm also biased. One of the issues that I'm for, increased funding for is mental health services because, I work with people, home health care with people with developmental disabilities. I feel that it's underfunded, but not as much as you would think. It's poorly funded. Like the funding goes to bad directions. Nonetheless, that's my bias, when it comes to my field of work. But what I'm saying is it might not seem like it's a big deal to just drop $500 billion at a time where we have inflation, with food prices are up 11.7% year to year. But I think it is. I think that this is the exact wrong time to have something like this. And I think that what you'll see is most of this money will go into the hands of corporations, Solyndra type groups that will end up getting money hand over fist and won't be providing solutions to problems in the way that you're suggesting. In fact, I don't know how much of this money is earmarked for sort of funding. And again, to my audience, I'm not conceding that what you're talking about with algae will solve all these problems. I'm highly skeptical of it, but I'm also not equipped about the specifics of it to have this conversation on the specifics of that.
Yeah.
But my question is, even if that did work, even if how much money is earmarked from that half a trillion or so to go to the sort of funding that you're directly talking about?
It's like $2 billion, like not that much. Yeah, out of the
Right.
300.
And I think that and I think even like the Inflation Reduction Act itself is over $1 trillion. So only half of it, which by the way, it's not an
700,
Inflation Reduction Act.
but yeah,
Okay. My bad.
okay.
You're right.
No, you're fine.
But it should have been called the Climate Change Act because that's where the majority of it's going.
Sure.
But, a lot of it's going to be Lagresse. The government spends corruptly. The government spends inefficiently. And, we can't continue this. Mm-hmm. We can't continue to just print trillions upon trillions upon trillions of dollars and devalue our currency. We're going to see the ramifications. We're already seeing it. Poor and working class people are already seeing it. And so, I guess the point I'm trying to make to you, even if you think that sending $2 billion to your field isn't just good for you, I don't think that's what you're saying. You're saying you sincerely believe it would be good for the country and the world, in fact, because this technology will be something that'll change the way we live in a very positive way. But can you see how I would be against, or many people like me would be against, this massive spending at a time of inflation?
Yeah, I think that the idea is to basically be investing into jobs and into manufacturing that is going to kind of give us the manufacturing power going forward so that we can make high quality products that we can sell and create, good quality, high paying jobs for in the future. I think that's kind of like the big idea in a lot of this stuff. So there's 5 major parts in the Inflation Reduction Act that we can go over. And I hear you. It is a lot of money, and but I think that in the end it's going to benefit poor and working class people. And maybe Solyndra and that kind of stuff. I mean, those are it's one of those things where 90% of startups fail, no matter what industry they are. So it's kind of, and a part of it, one of the reasons why they failed is because China was making so many of these, of these solar panels so cheaply, and they couldn't compete. So, hopefully that, once we kind of go from this Chinese centered manufacturing or mining and manufacturing and production and buying it and using it over here to more of an American centered thing, we can actually create more jobs here, and it'll be better for us in the future. So the first thing in I can send you, so it's hard to find.
If you could screen share, you could. I don't mind.
Yeah.
I don't know if we do that in Discord, and my audience can see it as well.
Here we go. Let's see. So it's hard to get oh man. It's going to be hard for me to do this. Can you see? Is it too small?
I could see it. I could read the bold. I gotta be honest. It's
okay.
My eyes.
Okay, let me. I'll just send it to you. It's a link to the PDF.
Are you sending it on Discord?
Yeah, on our DM.
I'll close.
So the first part.
So you can see our there when I looked at that, but we didn't say anything crazy in our Discord.
You're a good guy. It's okay. So this what this is basically the actual bill is 740 pages of stuff, and I'm not a lawyer, so I can't really understand it. This is the Democrats' summary of the climate change parts of the IRA. So that's what this what we're looking at right here. So the first part is lowering consumer energy costs. So this is exactly what you're talking about. By creating, home rebate programs and stuff, we can actually create more efficient systems for low income people to actually go and update their house. $9 billion on that. Consumer tax credits to make their homes energy efficient. And this is the third bullet here is this is brand new, by the way. They've never done this before. They've done it with new cars, but $4,000 to low middle income people to buy used clean vehicles, which is important. What we were talking about before, right? Where EVs need to actually be they need to be run for a little bit in order to get the climate the carbon footprint down. And then, so basically, the first bullet is basically all about lowering consumer energy costs.
I will say that, like, so I believe it was the GAO came out and they've just done their estimate that actually most of this is not true when it comes to at least the actual reduction on inflation. And like, so here's the problem, right? Like, we can go through all the points. That's no problem. I want you to do that. And, but like, let's take this specifically. This is optimistic, right? That will get to a change that will be able to lower cost in the future. That's part of what it's saying. And secondly, it's offering incentives to kind of transition towards that way now. But you can already see the problem with these incentives, right? Like, well, okay, if you're a homeowner, you're probably more well-to-do than someone who's not a homeowner anyways. And even this is tax credits and small amounts of money to make large changes. But those changes oftentimes require you to put your own money in as well. Yeah. And at this point, hardly anyone who's poor and many working class people don't have disposable income. So you can't take advantage of these sorts of things. If you can get $11,000 to completely rewire your home to be more energy efficient, but it's going to require you to put an additional $11,000 on top of it, you're not going to be able to take advantage. So what this is, and like the tax incentive to buy an electric car, even $4,000 to get a used vehicle that is clean. Even used electric vehicles are going to be out of the price range of almost everyone I know. And so what this is a massive subsidy to middle class and upper class people. Because it's not free money. It's going to cost something, and it's going to cost inflation. It will devalue the dollar. And so what happens is it's always the shell game. When the government prints money and then spends it on something, it's easy to look at that in it's sort of a bubble and say, oh, but wouldn't it be great? Like, for example, we could all see the problem if I just said, why don't we just send every American $100,000? Think of how they would be able to invest that money to being more energy efficient. True, but what's the cost of that? Well, that would obviously cause inflation. It would devalue the money and the price of everything would go up. We could see, well, that's exactly what's going to occur here. So you could look at it. In fact, the last bullet point here, it says a $1 billion grant program to make affordable housing more efficient. That's $1 billion out of a $700 billion bill. So even if that $1 billion was spent like, oh, okay, I could see how this would benefit some people. Like, I just think that this is overly optimistic in what it's saying here. And it's, to me, it's reminiscent of we'll pay people's student loans off. Right. That doesn't help the people that need the help the most. Right. We're massively printing money at the time of inflation where we're already, the M2 money supplies increased 50% since Biden's been in office. That's insane. And we're spending, CNBC was saying today, like, with the inflation numbers that just came out today, 8.3% year over year. I saw the one guy on CNBC saying, like, hardly a right-wing, talking point or network said, the lesson learned with inflation was the government spent way too much. So what was the Biden administration's response? Let's print another $700 billion. And so I'm skeptical. I understand that it's easy to say, well, if we transition to renewables and we give tax incentives to people to transition towards renewables, that'll help, people economically, but not really, because it fails to take into account the cost of massively printing this sort of money. So I just don't buy it. I think that I don't think on point one that it's actually going to help people lower their energy bills. I think, in fact, we'll see the opposite as we transition towards renewables. You could look, it's not just me saying this. You look at places like California, you look at places like Germany, look at what's going to happen in Europe this winter. As we force this change to renewables in an unnatural way through government regulation and things like that, what happens is people pay way more. Yeah. And that's what's happening right now at the pump.
As someone who's lived in California their entire lives, we had rolling brownouts before, the massive investment into renewables about 10 years ago. But yeah, I understand what you're saying. I don't, in regards to this only implying a bunch of home energy stuff. So it only impacts homeowners. Like, I'm with you, man. I rent and I want to buy, and it's that's a huge problem. I think, we should have more of a, look at, George W. Bush and Clinton's idea of like increasing the amount of home ownership in the country. And I think that we could do that without, leading to the subprime mortgage crisis that happened in 2008. And I think that a lot of those, it seems crazy to, spend all that money for banks bailing them out for being so reckless and fraudulent and putting those subprime mortgages in with AAA mortgages, and they knew it, and then on top of that, they leveraged like 100-to-1 their money, and then they still got bailed out. It just seems like that it's really frustrating to be like. For me, seeing that $800 billion being spent there, but then for in my opinion. We're looking at high-paying jobs in American manufacturing, and hopefully, you're right. I don't know what's going to happen, but if it does lower energy costs and make things more sustainable, then it's money well spent, in my opinion. But go ahead.
I'll just say this real quick. I promise, because if we take this on each point, we'll be here all night. But again, we've already gone through the litany of policies that we've seen governments around the world, including in California, make that I think we're corrupt. You probably think we're incompetent, that we're detrimental to people, and not only just detrimental to people's rights and people paying more, but actually counterintuitive to the very problem they were trying to solve, climate change. Germany's used more emissions and more fossil fuels this year because in the name of fighting climate change, they shut down a nuclear plant and they were relying on imports from Russia, which actually has less regulations on their production of fossil fuels than a place like Germany would have, or a place like the United States would have. And so now they're in a very bad situation because I think it was intentional, it was corrupt. But if you think, well, they had good motivations, they've actually caused the exact thing to be worse that they were trying to fight. Given that, and we've seen, and not just when it comes to climate change, that's the new, course du jour, but, how many times have we seen massive spending bills that we were told these spending bills are going to massively improve the lives of people because it's going to lower their costs of their day-to-day living, and it almost never does. And so given that we've seen all the mistakes they've made in the past, I understand your optimism, which is like, look, I think this is a serious problem. I think we need to do something about it. I'm excited that we're throwing money at this. But it's the same question that I have for, sort of social. I'm not saying you're a socialist, but socialists or progressives or democratic socialists, which is if you think that the people in charge now are corrupt or incompetent, why would they be right when it comes to the issues that you like? Why would now? Because the devil's in the details, right? Like you said, this is a 700-something page bill, right? We're not lawyers. Granted, we're looking at the DNC's talking points of how great it'll be, but we're not going through with a fine-tooth comb each line. So we'll see. And I just don't share your optimism. I think that they have shown themselves over. The same sort of messaging was given about the lockdowns and then the bailouts for COVID. Same messaging. Oh, this is going to be a massive boon for the poor and working class. It's going to massively help them. And what did we see? One of the largest transfers of wealth from the poor and working class to the upper class. Anytime, and so now the exact same people still in charge were like, why don't you print another $1 trillion, or $750 billion? This time you'll do it right. I just don't buy it. I don't.
I think the difference is that they're putting this money, a majority of this money, into the hands of manufacturing companies in the United States, shovel-ready pilot scale-up programs that aren't just like pie in the sky kind of like ideas from that haven't been researched yet or something like that. That we know it's going to work, but just put more money into it. These are things that have been proven. That the IPCC actually talks about that they have shown that the research around the world has really highlighted that they're good investments. So it's not just the United States, and it's scientists around the world that have shown that this is in the end for a lot of these. Specifically for wind and solar, and the domestic manufacturing. So that's what number 2 is all about. So number 2 is about the American energy security and domestic manufacturing. I mean, personally, like I said before, this is probably it's a national defense kind of thing. I think that's why it got passed. To be honest with you, it's because they were trying to create kind of like American manufacturing that hasn't really existed for a really long time in the United States. So. So number 2 is the production of tax credits for U.S. manufacturing, $30 billion of that, mineral processing, batteries, all that kind of stuff, $10 billion in to actually build those facilities, $500 million for heat pumps and critical mineral processing, and then this is interesting too, for $2 billion to retool the existing manufacturing that we have for clean energy stuff. So this isn't just like pie in the sky stuff. This is like tangible, shovel ready stuff, and I think that that's the big difference.
Well, I will just say that I will concede that this is of a scale, this sort of spending that we haven't seen in the United States. Mm-hmm. But there have been programs similarly, maybe not complete dollar amount similar, but similar huge investments or huge portions of GDP investments that have occurred in countries like Europe, correct? And the IPCC has praised those as well.
I mean, I'm an American, so they ain't nothing like United States. I hear you. They come here, man. They come here to learn. So,
but the point I'm trying to make, I think you can see where I'm going. Mm-hmm. The IPCC praised those programs and were touted as revolutionary and going to lead to the future. And what do we see happening right now? Massive increase in demand for coal, massive increase in demand for fossil fuels, countries, is it Germany that is now just legalized fracking again, right? They rolled back everything we were told, it was going to be like, trust us, this is going to create jobs. It's going to be a massive boon to the economy. It's going to help solve climate change. It's going to lower people's energy costs. And it was the exact opposite. And so now the IPCC is like, well, okay, that was a bust those times, but this time in the United States. And the only other thing I'll say about this is you've already admitted that 95% of the times that we're doing new investments and new startups and companies and things like that it fails. So just because billions of dollars is going to, places like, to build new facilities and this, that, and the other, how do we know that those will be successful? And I'll also point to you that regardless, I know you correctly point out a problem with fossil fuel subsidies, but these are billions of dollars that are going to wealthy people, that are going to companies that manufacture things that are already incredibly wealthy. And so this is, I guess we're relying on the good faith of my tax dollars going to massive auto manufacturers that are then going to create cars to sell back to me that I won't be able to afford. But I'm supposed to believe that, trust me, it'll work out for me in the end. I just don't.
Yeah, I mean, it's just to be clear, the IPCC is doing those assessments based off of the energy capability of the technology itself, and not going that the reports and stuff haven't been out since the IRA was passed. So I'd be interesting actually to see what their assessment of the IRA would be and the impacts that would have. I mean, the fact that, we invest money into, as a public entity, we invest money into these private corporations in order to do it, these things, and a lot of startups fail. I mean, a lot of the startups fail regardless of government subsidies. It's just kind of like a thing that happens. I mean, this is called the hidden hand of the market, right? Where, the money that is, if you don't work out as a company, then you go down and people kind of move around to the more successful companies. I mean, this is kind of just intrinsic to any kind of like public-private partnership, but I don't think that you would say that this should be nationalized either. So I think that, it's kind of like it's just intrinsic to capitalism, I would say. I don't know if I don't have an answer to that.
Right, but the problem is, like, for example, the last massive spending bill we had was sort of PPP loans and loans that came out regarding COVID. And the numbers for fraud coming out of them, there are numbers that suggest as much as 30 to 35% of the money that was spent was fraudulent.
Yeah.
We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars. And that's just straight up fraud. That's not someone took the money and then their business failed. Yeah. Right. And so I'm just like, again, it's the same song and dance. We're constantly told, here, print $1 trillion. We'll send it out. We're not sending it to you. We're not sending it to Joe Schmo American that's struggling right now. Instead, we're sending it to Ford, to Tesla. Yeah. Right. And then they're going to create something that's going to massively benefit you 10 years down the road. Okay. You can't afford what they're creating right now, right? And you're probably going to lose your home because of inflation, and we're busy sending money to these groups. But trust us, it'll work out for you in the future. So I'm not persuaded. I think that I just don't think.
How would you then, how would you tackle this? How would you say the problem was American energy security and domestic manufacturing of renewable energy? I mean, how would you impact those people, and how would you reach those people?
Well, I think that you're not going to like this answer. I think the problem started a decade ago. I think that this sort of ESG and this, artificially limiting ourselves in the Western world by limiting the use of cheap fossil fuels that were becoming cleaner and cleaner had set us down this dark path. So Trump famously told people in the Europe, I think it was the European Union, it might have been UN, but Germany laughed. The delegation from Germany laughed when he said, "You people are too reliant on cheap Russian oil," and they laughed at him. They're like, "We'll be fine." That's exactly what happened. In fact, if you listen to the Biden administration, they're blaming everything on Russia and Ukraine, which that's not an accurate portrayal. But it is certainly true that Europe's suffering because the very people that they were antagonistic against Russia and had constantly been sort of pushing up and up and up against, they were reliant on at the same time that they were being antagonistic to them. So the solution would have been 10 years ago to continue to maximize the cheap available technology that we had at the time, to exploit natural resources such as fossil fuels and not limit ourselves, do our best to make sure that we're doing so ethically and prudently, making it cleaner and cleaner, and be net exporters here in the United States, creating infrastructure to export to countries in the European Union so that we could be getting money and not only not rely on places like Russia, China, OPEC, etc., but we would actually be improving our lives as Americans by creating jobs here in that market and giving them cheap source of fuel that they're not reliant on enemies, which would improve the lives of those people. And the only people that would have been negatively impacted by this would have been countries like Russia and China that no longer would have a market share. So that's what should we do now? Well, unfortunately, we probably are going to experience some tough times, but the solution would be, when you're in a drastic, dire situation, you need to exploit cheap, provable resources that you can at the time. And so that means fossil fuels. That's what we should be using right now. And that's what you see when the rubber meets the road. Biden's tapping into the strategic reserves. Germany's lifting bans on fracking. We're begging OPEC to produce more oil because that's the solution. The solution's not going to be, well, we're going to invest in new technologies that might benefit you 10 years down the road, so just let us spend another $1 trillion. That's all that going to do is exacerbate inflation. And at best, it could improve people's lives 10, 15 years in the future. But we should stabilize ourselves. Massive advances in how we run our world, like massive technological advances that change everything, like the internet, the space age, etc., they can only occur in times of stability. If we're suffering global famines and we're suffering where poor people can't afford to pay their rent, I mean, we're talking about, if you look at some of these economic numbers, it's insane. Like, people are now using credit cards to buy food that 2 years ago had money saved in the bank. Credit card debt is exploding right now.
Yeah.
Real wages have fallen like 2.8% year to year, or maybe that's since Biden's been in office. But this is not the time to say, well, we're going to limit fertilizer so that people can't produce food. We're going to spend, print trillions of dollars in order to fight climate change. And that's why we started with the question of, well, how serious is it? How long do we have to act? What would the impacts of climate change be if we don't act? It didn't sound very urgent, the way you were talking about it. And when I say urgent, clearly you're saying it's important, but it didn't sound urgent like we need to spend trillions right now. We need to stop fertilizer production right now. We need to ban fossil fuel cars. It didn't seem that's what you were suggesting. And yet here we are spending $700 billion. And for what? It's not going to help the average person. I mean, how's it going to help the guy that's, family of four that can't pay his mortgage next month? I don't see any help there. The only thing it's going to help is lowering the price at the pump. And the price at the pump also affects your price of all your other goods, because most of our food, almost everything we use and consume, energy is a requirement of through transportation, through creation, etc. So that it's not the best answer in the world, but I know what doesn't work, and that's the Inflation Reduction Act and trillions of spending into, what I can see is in history shows us it doesn't work. And as we've had massive government investments and restrictions into renewable energy while restricting fossil fuels, like the Biden administration did when they came in, almost every single time we could see that who pays the price? It's poor and working class people. They're doing it right now in Europe. They're doing it in California. They're doing it all over the United States. We're supposed to be relieved that gasoline went from $5 a gallon to $4 a gallon when that's almost a 100% increase from when Biden came into office.
Yeah.
It's not sustainable.
The problem is, okay, well, first off, were you aware in this bill that it actually increases the amount of onshore and offshore oil production? It actually increases the amount of leases?
Was aware because this is the criticism that Democrats make of the bill.
Yeah.
Well, you're basically funding fossil fuels. Like Joe Manchin, this is why he said that he was for it. Yeah, it does make that claim, but that claim would have been able to be done without the 700 billion in spending. But sure.
Okay. All right, I just wanted to make sure because you were talking about that, but I think
no, it's fair that you bring that up. That is definitely fair.
And I think that like investing into fossil fuels and stuff like that is, I mean, one, the companies are already doing extremely well. That's the most profitable industry ever, and I mean fracking is. I mean, I think it's interesting. I don't know. I haven't been to these. This is just secondhand, anecdotes and stuff like that. But a lot of, from what I've heard, in the Dakotas and stuff like that, I mean, the fracking boom and bust have left a lot of these cities complete ghost towns. Because people move there, they use all the resources. A bunch of people, it all builds up, and then now like nobody's living there anymore. So I don't know if like. Would you be saying like increase the amount of fracking, like even in these places, or just increase the amount of fracking, like in general, or?
Oh, you're not wrong to an extent. I don't know the severity of that. I've heard the horror stories, but the horror stories are the same people that are telling me horror stories about the Great Barrier Reef not existing, and then it turns out that so it's hard to believe this stuff. And look, I'm not naive. I know propaganda is going to come in from all sides, right?
Yeah.
There's no doubt the fossil fuel industry is going to be putting propaganda out saying like, oh no, everything's fine, and the green energy industry is going to be putting propaganda saying we're all going to die, right? The truth's somewhere in between, But I don't dispute that the nature of fracking, the horizontal fracking that you're talking about, my very limited understanding of it. I have a friend that works on oil rigs. He knows way more about this. I've talked to him a little, right? But my limited understanding of it is we kind of force these gases in that's able to then take what we want out. But it kind of, like you use the term boomer bust. It's like we take it all out and then we leave, and then maybe it refills 20, 30 years in the future. But it's different than sort of a traditional oil well where it could pump for years and years. Fracking, and maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think, I'm basically agreeing with you that I think that it's kind of like, okay, you do it and then you move on.
I meant the economies. I meant the economies of the cities. They boom. A bunch of people are there, and then it's a bust, and then the economy.
Right. So that would intuitively follow. So, like, let's say there's a little town by where I live that fracking gets really huge in that little town, right? That town's probably then in the 3 years that the fracking's going there, going to see a massive growth because those are high paying jobs. So they're probably going to live in the area or stay in the area, which means things like restaurants pop up, things like stores, right? But then when those people leave, when the fracking leaves, now you've just taken a lot of that wealth that people that were there, they move on to another town. That's probably true. That probably happens to some extent, but that's sort of inevitable. That sort of thing happens all throughout history. And it sucks. But again, I think that you're focused sort of on this micro issue of jobs and micro issue of things like that. The greater issue, and that's not to say that it's not sad and tragic for those sorts of things to happen, but the greater issue is the energy production and the availability of the energy in the first place, because that's going to affect all of us. Right. And so if the argument is, well, we don't want to increase fracking right now because, 3 years from now, the places where the fracking's increased, those towns will suffer devastatingly, even though they'll benefit in the initial 3 years. It's like, yeah, but we're paying $4 a gallon for gas. Food prices are up 11.3%. That doesn't just affect these small towns or even large towns across the country. That's affecting everyone. And so, I would rather see a world where government intervention is not necessary at all. But because of the massive restrictions that the government has put on fossil fuels through ESG, not just in the United States, but around the world, now we find ourselves in a dire situation. And instead of saying, listen, begrudgingly, and somewhat, you are seeing this somewhat begrudgingly, we are going to have to burn more fossil fuels. Coal demand, for example, in 2022 is at highs that we haven't seen in 12 years. The demand for burning coal. Because we set up all these policies before we were ready to transition to renewables, which made a bunch of people incredibly wealthy and infringed on people's rights around the world. And now we have to burn even more coal. And now CO2 emissions are increasing because these policies were either ineffective or, I believe, corrupt. And so, to me, now we're regrettably in a situation where it's like, okay, we got to do something fast. And, hoping for a technology to completely change our infrastructure 10 years from now, that doesn't help people right now. Yeah. It doesn't. Maybe I would agree with you. I wouldn't, but maybe a policy like this would be more agreeable. It certainly would be more agreeable if we were in a period of economic boom. right? If everyone was doing well, like we had this sort of Bill Clinton economy, where it's like, oh, everybody's great. It's the economy's stupid. Maybe then's the chance to say, okay, let's take a large percentage of our GDP and massively change our infrastructure and our energy. Now, I don't think I would agree with that then, but at least it's more palpable.
Yeah.
But I can't. How do you tell? How do you? I mean, go ahead. Sorry. I know I'm wordy.
No, that's fine. No, I enjoy it. It's hard to imagine, like, if everything's going swimmingly, people are going to be like, oh, let's change things up. So, I agree.
Well, that's true. But you would admit, right? Like for example, you're not gonna. Let's say me personally, right? Like, let's say that and this is basically true of me. I'm living paycheck to paycheck, mostly because I was stupid in college and got drunk all the time instead of graduating. It's when my friends did. My debate partners, that prick somewhere making huge money. Now he's still one of my best friends. He's a great guy, but he's making good money, right? Yeah. Like, I decided to drink all the time. But I'm happy. I'm one of the happiest people you know. I'm living paycheck to paycheck. Let's say right now, me and my wife are going through bills, and she says, what we should do? You should buy an electric car. And I'm like, we barely have money to pay the mortgage this month. She's like, well, just drop $60,000. Let's just do that. Buy an electric car. And it's very important. It's important for the environment, and it'll save us money in the long term. My answer to that would be, listen, this is something we can talk about once we're not in a situation when we're living paycheck to paycheck. Yeah. I can't make this drastic change right now. Now, you might be right to say, yeah, but if you were doing good, then maybe you'd be like, well, who the hell needs a change? No need to worry about things financially if things are so good. Maybe, but that's at least more prudent to bring the topic up than when you're barely getting by. And unfortunately, how many people, I know you're not advocating for it, but the same sorts of people, the climate change alarmists that are advocating for the Inflation Reduction Act, also are advocating for banning fertilizers. In the time of a famine, when people are starving. The UN said that it's something like close to 1 billion people are in danger of starvation around the world. Yeah. I mean, this is insane. What logic justifies that right now, at this particular time, that this is when we're going to curtail fertilizer production? This is when we're going to curtail farm production. The only explanation is that it's intentional. But you don't have to believe that. I'm not asking you to believe that. I'm just using that as an example to look at then these people advocating this spending at the time of when we have massive inflation. And then the coup de grace is they call it the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, that to me is like, it lets you know exactly what they're thinking, right? Where it's like, okay.
I think the title's
not
weird
intended
too.
To do
if it makes you feeling better. I think it's a climate change bill, in my opinion. But
that's exactly what.
Yeah. I mean, so I guess I would argue that the economy in California is doing pretty well right now. We have $100 billion surplus right now every year in California. So them spending, $55 billion for, climate change is probably a good time. In regards to, your personal finances and stuff like that, I think that, getting back to the IRA, like hopefully these tax credits and these installation costs and now more competition, right? Because more solar panel companies are going to be made, panels are going to be made here. They're going to be installed, more installation companies through that competition, in the market. Hopefully that reduces the cost of the installation and the panels themselves. And then they're talking about real things where you're actually, I have friends with solar panels and stuff where they're paying, like some months they don't pay anything, for their solar, their electricity bill. So we're talking about real benefits, that actually impact, the day to day of people. And I like talking about that stuff because that's what's important, and it should have an impact in people's lives. As regards to the the specific governance of Germany or whatever, I hadn't heard of that. I had heard that in passing, and I thought that was ridiculous. But I'll look at it and read up more up on it.
So we're coming on 2 hours. I was thinking this. I'll just kind of give a few closing thoughts, but I want to give you the last word. You can talk as long as you want. Well, within reason. Like, I do work at 7 a.m. tomorrow, so you can, maybe 4 hours would be. But I'll just close real quickly. I think started off, I think we both agreed the conversation to have was how bad is climate change? What do we need to do to fix it? And then the specifics of the Inflation Reduction Act. I think through this conversation, I'm sadly left, not just you, I think that this is true of climatology in general. There's no really dedicated answers as to why it is, how bad things will get, and why now is the key urgent time to do all of these policies. And I think it fails to ignore, or it fails to take into account that there have been alarmist claims that have been going since at least the 60s here in the United States that have been unbelievably wrong, and that people have gotten incredibly wealthy off of predicting things that ended up being very untrue. And the people that have paid the price for that have almost always, not just in the United States, but around the world, been poor and working class people. I think that we're seeing that these sort of restrictions going to affect poor and working class people in Europe right now. It's affecting people in the United States that are paying way more through inflation, both the spending bills and the restricting of cheap fossil fuels. And I just think that there's no good time to have massive government control, but certainly this time is one of the worst times. My belief is, and we didn't get into it, I think that the reality is that it's a hoax. I think the climate is changing, and I think that there are negative impacts, but I think it's a hoax in that the people that are saying that it is the most severe and that it's do or die know that it's a grift, and they're getting incredibly powerful and wealthy off it. And I think that creating scarcity, these programs that they use are always designed to punish poor and working class people, and I think that it's intentional. That doesn't mean that I'm saying climate change is a hoax, as if the climate's not changing or that there aren't bad impacts of it, but I think it's massively being blown out of proportion on purpose. And I think you can see, just like with COVID, the people that are yelling the rallying cry the worst are buying oceanfront property, are flying on private jets, and things of that nature. And that's how you can understand how, in the time of a global famine, they would actually be curtailing fertilizer production, which will exacerbate that. There's no good time to do this, but now is the worst time to do it. So as far as the severity and needing to act now, I just think that that's not true. And when it comes to the Inflation Reduction Act, I understand the Democrats are going to say that it's good. I have problems with everything they're suggesting. And, to me, it's just another bill that was misled to people. It was basically just Green New Deal light. We were misled because they knew people were concerned about inflation. They know it will exacerbate inflation, but they couldn't admit that. Oh, thanks for the raid, preacher. They couldn't admit that. And so instead, they called it the Inflation Reduction Act. And it's basically just a giveaway to middle class and wealthy people. And we're sending billions of dollars that are going to go to large corporations that will no doubt then support their Democrats in their next election through helping their campaign. But and that's my closing thoughts on it. And I'd like to give Greg the final word here.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, man. I just wanted to go through the real quick, the other three parts just to really quickly. So we're going to go.
I'm listening, but someone's at the door, but I'm listening. Keep going.
No problem. So number 3 would be decarbonize the economy. So this is basically trying to put billions of dollars into electric utilities and things that the energy that's needed in order to kind of like make our economy move and that kind of thing, to make it more sustainable and renewable energy. We're talking about like the transportation sector and those kind of things. Clean energy accelerators, and which are businesses and startup programs and that kind of thing. And then number 4 would be a kind of an investing in communities and environmental justice. So basically, we're talking, since we know that environmental health is tied to human health because of pollution, we're trying to remove the amount of pollution in the air and in our water, and these have like tangible impacts on health and health outcomes, and we know that. And then the 5th one is really interesting because this is the farmers, forest land owners, and resilient rural communities that are going to be impacted. So like you had said, Rob, this is interesting. This is $20 billion to support climate smart agricultural processes. So that would be things like fertilizers and stuff like that less runoff, that kind of thing. And then $2.6 billion to conserve and restore coastal habitats. So that's what I was talking about before with wetlands and that kind of stuff. So anyway, so that was just like kind of the quick overview, but notes on your closing statement. So how bad it is, and the kind of final thoughts on that. I want to stress right now, there is a mass extinction that is happening right now. It's called the Anthropocene. So basically, this is how humans are impacting all these different ecosystems, and there's a mass die-off that's happening right now. We have no sequencing for a lot of these organisms. We have no idea how to rehabilitate them or create them if they go down. We have niche kind of projects going, like restoring the woolly mammoth or stuff like that. But there's no way that scientists know how to actually bring back an entire ecosystem, and that's a lot of things that we can actually lose there. For example, we could have cascading impacts into oxygen production, but also we could have things like microbiology and technology advancements inside those things that are lost. So, for example, where a lot of our medicines come from are naturally occurring in nature, and then we found them, and then now we use them. So, by losing them, we actually lose a lot of technology development as well. So, you can't really put a number on it. You can't really say, because we don't know, right? We don't know what we don't know, kind of thing. So, it's innumerable, the things that we could lose, and that's happening right now. And how long before it all goes away and it all dies, you can't say that, but there is a mass extinction that we know that's happening right now. As far as it being kind of like a grift or I just want to say, scientists are not paid well at all. We are not it's kind of like as a passion project or a passion of love. My scientist friends and I constantly talk about man, we could have gone into finance and just made money on an Excel spreadsheet a lot easier than this. What are we we're trying to think about, trying to invent things and trying to engineer new things. This is, it's almost an impossible challenge. And ecology and biology in general has been studied for hundreds of years before, climate change kind of has been happening. So, for example, there's birding, which is a hobby that's happened a lot in the UK, for example. So we know migrations of bird patterns and the biodiversity and bird numbers that have existed for hundreds of years now. And people use that to employ and really get to know what's happening with migrations. I just want to say, I hate the CO2 based emissions scaremongering, because it creates a monster that's so insurmountable that nobody can actually do anything. And I want to stress that there's a lot of different ways that you can actually impact the environment positively. There's things, for example, you could, if you care, basically, I think that everyone should fall in love with nature somehow. Figure out ways that you can actually connect with. Maybe you go on a hike. Maybe you have your dog that goes to a local park or something like that. See, what kind of animals are there? What kind of insects are there? Go insect hunting. Figure out, maybe it's a beach. What's happening there? And then figure out ways to kind of get involved. Try to figure out ways that you can try to help conserve that habitat. And if they try to put a parking lot in the center of it and bifurcate the area, which is happening a lot, then you could get involved with things like zoning commissions is actually a really good way to get involved with keeping and conserving habitats there, but then also restoring animal populations, because we know that interconnected natural spaces are ways to really to rehabilitate animal populations and biodiversity. So it's the CO2 ppm kind of outlook creates a scenario that it's too hard for us to even surmount, and it creates this whole why would we even try to do anything if China or India is not going to do it at the same time? What's the point? And it creates this kind of NWO world government thing that needs to happen, and it's that's international and national level governance that needs to happen. You can have a huge impact on the environment and through the people around you, through the governments around you. So, if it's not climate change, I in general, I just recommend everyone kind of get involved with your city hall, get on the boards, get on the commissions, because those are, unelected spaces that you can actually get on. And, 5 hours a month, you can have a huge impact on your local communities. And it's just interesting, one. And then two, it makes your community a better place. So that's what I recommend.
Yeah, I agree with that portion of it. Also, to people, there are conservation groups that you can get in contact with on almost any community, whether it be
Hmm.
urban or rural. And it doesn't even. Maybe you're just like, I hate politics. I don't want to give up. There are literally people that could help you. Like, one of the things I did in school, it sounds stupid. We used to take old Christmas trees that people threw out,
Hmm.
and then you would take it to the national parks, or I guess the state park service, and they would take those trees and they would have you help them bundle them up and use as habitats for like species such as rabbits, chipmunks, or sometimes you'd put them in the water for spawning fish.
Hmm.
It sounds stupid, but it's actually something that's measurable that
Yeah.
you're doing, and like that has not that is if you have zero appetite for politics or anything like that, you trust me, there was no politics involved in that. That was just literally going out in the woods and having fun with friends and doing that sort of stuff. So yeah, I think that that's our biggest area of agreement that I'm surprised with, that there are tangible things we could do in the environment right now as individuals and that we should be striving to do that. So
Absolutely. Well, Rob, I really appreciate your time. I had a great conversation with you, man.
yeah, and I just want to say I'm so sorry again that we had to
Oh,
reschedule.
no,
I
it's
think
okay.
it was definitely worthwhile. I would be happy to talk to you again. Maybe, in a year or so, you could update us on what's going on in your field, because I think that it is interesting.
Cool.
And even though I think, listen, I'm cheering for cheap, available energy that is clean. I
Hmm.
really am. I think that the government, I have my problems with the government forcing it and spending trillions of dollars. But, I think it's an interesting topic of conversation, and I would love to talk to you about that in the future.